the big muscular princess no man wanted to marry. Princess Athena stood before the ornate mirror in her royal chambers, her reflection a stark contrast to the delicate paintings of past queens that adorned the walls. At 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and biceps that could put the palace guards to shame, she was anything but the traditional image of royal femininity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, revealing a strong jawline and determined eyes that held more interest in warfare strategies than court gossip. "Your Highness Lady Margaret," her chief lady-in-waiting, called from behind a mountain of discarded gowns. "Perhaps if we try the blue silk." The seamstress added extra fabric to accommodate your unique frame. Athena suppressed a sigh as she turned from the mirror. "Another dress won't change who I am, Margaret." We both know that she flexed her muscled arms, and the seams of her current gown groaned in protest. 3 seamstresses had already quit this month, defeated by the challenge of crafting formal wear for a princess who could bench press a small horse. In the courtyard below, preparations were underway for yet another grand ball, the 4th this season. Noble families from across the realm would present their sons, each hoping to secure a marriage alliance with Meridia's only heir. The kingdom buzzed with whispered concerns about their unusual princess, who spent her mornings in the training yard instead of learning needlepoint, who could outlift any man in the guard, and who remained stubbornly unmarried as her 21st birthday approached. A knock at the door heralded Queen Eleanor's arrival. Her mother's face, still beautiful but lined with worry, took in the scene the rejected gowns, the frustrated lady-in-waiting, and her daughter's imposing figure. "The delegation from the Western Kingdoms arrives tomorrow," the Queen announced, her voice careful. "Their princes are said to be quite progressive in their thinking." Athena met her mother's hopeful gaze. "Progressive enough to marry a princess who can throw them over the castle walls." "Athena, please." Queen Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "You know what's at stake. The alliance treaties, the trade agreements, they all depend on securing a suitable match. Your father and I have given you time, but you must understand that a princess's duty is to her kingdom." Athena finished. "I know, mother. But tell me, how can I lead our people if I must first make myself smaller to please a husband who fears his wife's strength?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the sound of training swords echoed from the yard below, a reminder of the growing distance between who Princess Athena was and who her kingdom expected her to be. The training yard came alive at dawn, when most of the palace still slept. Athena moved through her morning routine with practiced precision, each sword strike and defensive maneuver honed by years of dedication. Master Klaus, her long-time instructor and one of the few who truly understood her, watched from the sidelines as she decimated another practice dummy. "Your technique has improved," he noted, stroking his grey beard. "Though I suspect this morning's intensity has less to do with training and more to do with yesterday's incident with Prince Edmund." Athena's next strike nearly severed the dummy's head. The previous day's disastrous meeting with the latest suitor still burned in her memory. Prince Edmund had taken one look at her muscled form during their formal introduction and actually fainted dead away in the throne room. Can you blame him? Athena wiped sweat from her brow. He was expecting a delicate flower and got a warrior instead. She paused, remembering how it all began. "You know, father used to encourage this, my training. Remember?" Klaus nodded, a fond smile crossing his weathered face. "Indeed. King Marcus was so proud when you first showed interest in swordsmanship. A ruler must understand the art of war, he'd say. That was before." Before the council started pressuring him about succession and alliances, Athena finished. "Before mother began counting my grey hairs and lamenting her lack of grandchildren." Her journey to this point hadn't been a simple one. As a child, she'd discovered her unusual strength while playing in the palace gardens, lifting stone benches that grown men struggled to move. Instead of discouraging her, King Marcus had seen potential in his daughter's unique gifts. He'd arranged for the finest combat instructors, strategists, and weapons masters to train her alongside her traditional princess lessons. But as she grew, so did the whispers. Ladies of the court watched in horror as the princess developed muscles instead of marriageable graces. Young nobles who might have been potential suitors began avoiding royal functions. The council members grew increasingly vocal about their concerns. "Your Highness," a page's voice interrupted her, reminiscing. "The king and queen request your presence in the royal study." Athena found her parents deep in discussion with Lord Chancellor Burke, their voices hushed but tense. They fell silent as she entered, her training clothes a stark contrast to their formal attire. "Athena, dear Queen Eleanor," began, smoothing her skirts nervously. "We've been discussing your situation." "My situation?" Athena crossed her arms, her biceps straining against her sleeve. "You mean my continued failure to attract a husband who won't run away in terror?" King Marcus winced. Once her strongest supporter, he now looked torn between pride in his daughter's achievements and fear for the kingdom's future. "The council has concerns, daughter. Valid ones. Our treaties with neighboring kingdoms are built on the assumption of marriage alliances. Without such bonds, the Eastern territories are already making noise about renegotiating trade agreements." Lord Burke cut in. "They see our lack of secure succession as a sign of weakness." "So I should weaken myself to appear strong?" Athena challenged. "Perhaps if I stop training, let my muscles waste away, learn to simper and faint like a proper princess." "No one is asking you to change who you are," Queen Eleanor interjected, though her eyes darted to Athena's prominent arm muscles. "But perhaps some adjustments to your presentation." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another messenger, announcing the latest batch of potential suitors. 3 princes from the Southern Isles had arrived, each bearing gifts and marriage proposals. The following days became a parade of increasingly awkward encounters. Prince Theodore, the eldest, could barely maintain eye contact, his gaze constantly dropping to her arms with a mixture of fear and fascination. Prince Gabriel attempted to engage her in discussion about needlework and flower arrangement, steadfastly ignoring her attempts to steer the conversation toward military strategy. The youngest, Prince William, at least managed to join her for a morning training session, only to leave the palace immediately after being thrown to the ground during a simple sparring match. The kingdom's reaction to their unusual princess was equally divided. The common people, particularly young girls, had begun to view her as something of a folk hero. Stories spread about Princess Athena's feats of strength, how she'd once lifted a collapsed cart off a trapped child, or single-handedly defended a village from bandits while traveling the countryside. Some parents even encouraged their daughters to take up training, much to the horror of more traditional nobles. The palace guards respected her, having witnessed her skill firsthand during training sessions. Market vendors saved their finest weapons and armor for her inspection, rather than their usual offerings of jewelry and silk. But the noble families whispered behind their fans about the tragedy of such a powerful kingdom being left to such an unconventional heir. One afternoon, after another failed courtship attempt, Athena found herself in the palace archives, surrounded by portraits of past rulers. Her ancestors stared down at her queens, known for their beauty and gentle demeanor, kings celebrated for their strength and courage. None quite like her. "I thought I might find you here," Klaus's voice echoed through the chamber, seeking wisdom from the past. "Looking for precedent," Athena replied, gesturing to the paintings. "Surely I can't be the first royal to break the mold." Klaus studied the portraits thoughtfully. "Perhaps not, but you might be the first strong enough to forge a new one." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your strength frightens them, not because it makes you less, but because it forces them to question everything they believe about power and leadership. And fear, Your Highness, often masks respect." Athena touched the hilt of her sword, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Then perhaps it's time they learned to respect what they fear," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decision. "Because I won't become less to make them feel more." The setting sun cast long shadows through the archive windows, painting the portraits of past rulers in new light. Among them, Athena stood not a failed princess, but perhaps the beginning of something entirely new. The grand ballroom of Meridia Palace sparkled with candlelight, filled with nobles from every corner of the realm. It was the social event of the season, another carefully orchestrated attempt to find Princess Athena a suitable match. She stood near her throne, towering over most of her would-be suitors in her specially tailored emerald gown, trying not to notice how the crowd parted around her like water around a rock. "Lord Hampshire's son is quite accomplished," Queen Eleanor whispered, nodding toward a slim young man who quickly looked away when Athena caught his eye. "He's written several scholarly works on butterfly migration." "Fascinating," Athena muttered, watching the young lord scurry away. "I'm sure he'll be thrilled to marry someone who could accidentally crush him while turning a page in his butterfly books." The queen's lips tightened, but before she could respond, The herald announced their latest guest, Prince Victor of the Crystal Lakes, master of classical dance and poetry. The prince who entered was handsome in a delicate way, with flowing golden hair and artistic hands that had clearly never held anything heavier than a quill. He approached Athena with practiced grace, though his rehearsed smile faltered when he had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. "Princess Athena," he said, voice wavering slightly, "your beauty is as formidable as the tales suggest." "Thank you, Prince Victor." Athena tried to curtsy without ripping her dress seams. "I hear you're quite the dancer." Oh yes, his confidence returned as he discussed his passion. "I've studied every form of classical dance. Perhaps you'd honor me with." He paused, finally taking in her full stature. "That is, I'm not sure I could lead properly." "Because I'm stronger than you," Athena supplied bluntly. The prince's face reddened. "I simply meant traditional dance roles require that." As he backed away, bumping into a servant and nearly upending a tray of wine. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I see an old acquaintance." Athena watched him flee, adding another name to her mental list of failed courtships. Across the room, she caught sight of her father deep in conversation with his advisors, their serious expressions suggesting this wasn't mere party chatter. "Your Highness," a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Klaus appeared at her side, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire. "Perhaps some fresh air." Grateful for the excuse, Athena followed him to one of the balconies overlooking the palace gardens. The night air cooled her flushed skin as she gripped the stone railing, careful not to crack it, as she had during a similar moment of frustration last month. "I saw Prince Victor's hasty departure," Klaus remarked. "Not a fan of dancing." "Not a fan of partners who might accidentally lift him during a waltz," Athena said bitterly. "Did you know some of the nobles have started calling me the giantess behind my back, as if I'm some sort of freak show attraction?" Klaus leaned against the railing beside her. "And what do you call yourself when no one else is listening?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know anymore. A failure of a princess, perhaps. A disappointment. The kingdom's biggest diplomatic liability." "Really?" Klaus raised an eyebrow. "Because I see a warrior, a leader, someone who could protect this realm better than any treaty sealed with a marriage contract." "If only the council shared your view," Athena sighed. "They see my strength as a liability, not an asset. Did you know they've started suggesting I take special tonics? Herbs to soften my appearance, to make me more marriageable." Inside, the music continued to play, but a commotion near the main doors drew their attention. A messenger had arrived, his riding clothes dusty from hard travel. King Marcus quickly gathered his advisors, their faces growing grave as they received the news. Athena started to move toward them, but her mother intercepted her. "Darling, Prince Roland of the Summer Isles has been asking about you. He's quite interested in your unique qualities." "Mother, something's wrong." "I should." "You should attend to your suitors," Queen Eleanor insisted. "Your father will handle any problems. That's why finding you a suitable match is so important to maintain these alliances in times of crisis." But Athena had already spotted another messenger arriving, this one bearing the colors of their northern neighbors. The whispers spreading through the ballroom carried fragments of alarming news: borders, threats, military movements. Breaking away from her mother, Athena strode toward her father's gathering, her presence causing conversations to halt mid-sentence. "Father? What's happening?" King Marcus looked torn between his roles as monarch and father. "The northern kingdoms are mobilizing their forces. There are rumors of an alliance forming against us, testing our borders because they believe we're vulnerable." "Because of me," Athena finished. "Because I haven't secured a marriage alliance." The silence that followed was answer enough. Lord Burke cleared his throat. "Perhaps if we announced your engagement, any engagement, it would stabilize the situation." Prince Victor seemed quite cultured. "He ran away from a dance," Athena snapped. "How do you think he'd handle a war?" The party had ground to a halt, the assembled nobles watching the drama unfold. Athena felt the weight of their stares, their judgments, their fears. For years she'd tried to balance who she was with who they wanted her to be, and now that tension threatened to tear the kingdom apart. In that moment, something shifted inside her. She stood straighter, her full height and strength on display. "Show me the military reports," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority she'd spent years tempering. Princess Lord Burke sputtered. "Such matters aren't suitable for." "For whom?" "A princess?" A woman? Or someone who spent years studying military strategy while you were all focused on finding me a husband? She turned to Klaus. Bring me the maps from the war room. And someone find General Santos. I want his assessment of our northern defenses. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Queen Eleanor looked ready to faint. But King Marcus studied his daughter with new eyes, seeing not the matrimonial failure they'd all lamented, but perhaps the leader they'd needed all along. The war room, he declared, silencing the whispers. Now. As Athena followed her father out, she caught fragments of conversation from the abandoned party. Did you see how she took command? Quite shocking, but then again. Perhaps what we thought was a flaw. But the traditions. In the war room, surrounded by maps and reports instead of suitors and dance cards, Athena felt a sense of clarity she'd never experienced in the ballroom. The northern kingdoms had mistaken her unconventional nature for weakness, never considering that a princess who could wield a sword might be exactly what they should fear. They're counting on internal conflict, she said, studying the troop movements. They think we're distracted by succession politics, that we'll be too busy arguing about marriages to mount an effective defense. General Santos nodded approvingly. The princess is right. They're probing for weakness, but they don't expect significant resistance. Not yet. Then let's show them how wrong they are. Athena's finger traced potential counter-movements on the map. We have an advantage they haven't considered. And what's that? Lord Burke asked, still looking uncomfortable with her presence in this traditionally male domain. Athena smiled, and for the first time in years she felt no need to apologize for who she was. They're looking for a delicate princess worried about finding a husband. Instead, they're going to find a warrior queen ready to defend her kingdom. The crisis looming on their borders would test more than just their military might. It would challenge everything the kingdom thought they knew about strength, leadership, and the true measure of a ruler's worth. As Athena bent over the maps, her muscles rippling beneath her ball gown, she realized that perhaps this was the moment she'd been training for all along, not to make herself smaller, but to grow into the leader her kingdom never knew it needed. The northern wind carried the first signs of war as dawn broke over Meridia's capital. Scouts had reported enemy forces massing at 3 strategic points along the border, their numbers growing daily. In the palace war room, Princess Athena had barely slept, poring over maps and battle plans, while the kingdom's nobles still debated about proper protocol for a princess taking command. The Northern Alliance expects us to follow traditional defensive strategies, Athena explained, moving markers across the tactical map. They'll be preparing for our forces to dig in at the major cities, waiting for relief from allied kingdoms, allies we don't have because I didn't marry into them. General Santos studied the deployments she proposed. This is unconventional, Your Highness. Moving our main force through the Dragon's Spine Mountains. The terrain alone. This is exactly why they won't expect it, Athena finished. I've trained in those mountains since I was 14. The paths are treacherous, but I know routes that can support a mobile force. Lord Burke's face had grown increasingly red during the discussion. This is absurd. You're talking about personally leading troops into battle? Princess Athena, your place is in the palace, where we can protect. Protect what? Athena's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. A marriage prospect? A political bargaining chip? Tell me, Lord Burke, what good are my elegant dance steps and refined manners if our kingdom falls? The room fell silent. King Marcus, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. My daughter has spent years preparing for leadership, though none of us recognized it for what it was. I say let her prove herself. Within hours, Athena had exchanged her royal gowns for armor specially forged to fit her powerful frame. The sight of their princess in battle gear caused a stir among the troops, but any doubts about her capability vanished during preparation drills. She could outfight any soldier in close combat, while her strategic mind kept pace with veteran commanders. The first test came sooner than expected. A large enemy force, confident in their superior numbers, pushed across the border toward the capital. They expected to find a disorganized kingdom paralyzed by internal politics. Instead, they met Athena. She led the vanguard herself, her unusual strength allowing her to fight tirelessly while inspiring her troops. The enemy's formations broke against their defense like waves against a cliff, unprepared for the ferocity of a force led by the warrior princess they'd dismissed as a diplomatic failure. But the true turning point came 3 days into the conflict. Enemy scouts had failed to detect Athena's forces moving through the supposedly impassable mountain passes. While their main army engaged Meridia's defensive lines, Athena led a select force through the treacherous terrain she knew so well. Old formation, she called out, as they navigated a particularly narrow ledge. This path will take us right behind their supply lines. Her own strength proved crucial as she helped soldiers across difficult passages, sometimes literally carrying wounded men to safety. The enemy never saw them coming. In a single night raid, Athena's force disrupted their entire supply chain. She personally led the charge into their main camp, her years of training evident in every sword stroke and tactical decision. Soldiers who had come expecting to fight a weak kingdom ruled by a misfit princess instead found themselves facing a legendary warrior. Word spread quickly through both armies. Enemy troops spoke in whispers about a giantess who could throw grown men as easily as she wielded a sword, whose battle strategies were as powerful as her muscles. But more importantly, Meridia's own people began to see their princess in a new light. The decisive battle came at dawn on the 5th day. Athena stood before her assembled forces, her armor bearing the scars of previous fights, her presence commanding complete attention. They thought our kingdom was weak because its princess didn't fit their expectations. She projected her voice across the gathered troops. They thought my strength was a flaw, that my refusal to diminish myself made us vulnerable. Today we show them that true strength comes in many forms, and that Meridia's greatest asset is not its marriage prospects, but its fighting spirit. The cheer that went up from the troops rattled the very mountains. The battle that followed would be remembered for generations. Athena led from the front, her tactical genius matching her physical prowess. When enemy forces threatened to overwhelm their left flank, she personally held a crucial choke point, her superhuman strength allowing her to move fallen trees into defensive positions. Her presence rallied wavering units, and her quick thinking turned enemy advantages into fatal flaws. The Northern Alliance's commanding general, upon seeing his carefully laid plans crumble, demanded to meet this warrior princess face to face. When Athena strode into the negotiation tent, towering over everyone present, he finally understood his critical error. "We were told your kingdom was weakened by internal strife," he admitted. "That your unusual nature had left you without allies." Athena planted her sword point first into the ground, her muscles rippling with the casual display of strength. "You mistook uniqueness for weakness, General. A costly error." The peace terms were negotiated within hours. The Northern Alliance withdrew, their leaders having learned a harsh lesson about judging strength by traditional standards. But the real transformation was happening within Meridia itself. Nobles who had once whispered behind their fans about the tragedy of their unfeminine princess now spoke with pride about her victories. Young girls who had been taught to hide their strength began training openly, inspired by their warrior princess. Even the most traditional council members had to admit that Athena's unusual qualities had saved the kingdom more effectively than any marriage alliance. In the aftermath of the victory, the palace hosted another grand gathering, but this was no marriage market. It was a celebration of their princess's leadership, attended by military leaders and common soldiers alike. Athena entered the great hall in her battle armor, her sword at her side, no longer apologizing for taking up space. "Your Highness," General Santos approached, bowing deeply. "The troops have a new name for you. They call you the Shield of Meridia." A far better title than the giantess, she smiled, remembering the old whispers. King Marcus stood to address the gathering, his voice carrying pride that had nothing to do with marriage prospects. "My daughter once told me that a princess's duty is to her kingdom. I realize now that none of us truly understood what that meant. We looked for strength in alliances and treaties, never seeing that the greatest strength was right before us, in a form we didn't expect." The assembled crowd cheered, and Athena caught sight of Lord Burke actually wiping away tears. Queen Eleanor, who had spent years worrying about her daughter's marriage prospects, now stood tall beside her warrior child, finally seeing her true value. Perhaps Athena addressed the gathering, "It's time we reconsidered what makes a ruler truly strong. Not the ability to make an advantageous marriage, but the courage to be oneself fully, to use every gift in service of one's people." The celebration lasted well into the night, but it marked more than just a military victory. It was the moment Meridia realized that their greatest blessing wasn't finding a princess who could fit traditional expectations, but having one strong enough to shatter them. In the months following Meridia's victory, Change swept through the kingdom like a fresh wind. The palace halls, once filled with whispers about Princess Athena's unconventional nature, now echoed with tales of her strategic brilliance and battlefield prowess. Where nobles had once gathered to discuss potential suitors, they now came seeking her counsel on matters of state and defense. On a crisp autumn morning, Princess Athena stood before the royal council, her presence commanding the chamber in a way that had nothing to do with her physical stature. For generations, she began, we have measured a ruler's worth by their ability to forge alliances through marriage. Today I propose we forge them through strength, wisdom, and mutual respect instead. The council chamber, once her greatest source of criticism, had transformed. Lord Burke, who had so often pushed for traditional solutions, was the first to rise in support. Your Highness has proven that true leadership transcends our old assumptions. Perhaps it's time our laws reflected this wisdom. Over the following weeks, Athena worked with the kingdom's legislators to draft new laws of succession. The requirements for royal marriage were revised, removing the pressure for heirs to marry by a certain age. More significantly, the laws were changed to recognize different forms of alliance building, acknowledging that diplomatic ties could be strengthened through means other than marriage. You realize Queen Eleanor said one evening, as they reviewed the new statutes, that some will see this as you avoiding marriage entirely. Athena smiled at her mother, noting how the worry lines had faded from the queen's face. I'm not avoiding marriage, mother. I'm ensuring that if I marry, it will be because I've found someone who values strength rather than fears it. The impact of these changes rippled throughout society. Young women who had once been taught to diminish themselves began training alongside the palace guards. The Royal Academy, previously focused on teaching nobles the arts of courtly romance, now offered classes in strategy and leadership to anyone who showed promise, regardless of their background or appearance. King Marcus, watching his daughter preside over a military strategy session, remarked to Klaus, "We spent years trying to fit her into a role that was too small. All this time, she wasn't the one who needed to change, we were." The transformation was perhaps most visible in the way the kingdom's children played. Where young girls had once been scolded for unladylike displays of strength, they now enacted playground versions of Princess Athena's famous battles. Parents who had previously fretted about their daughters' untraditional interests now spoke proudly of raising little shields of Meridia. On the anniversary of the Northern victory, Athena made her most significant decision yet. Standing before a gathered crowd in the palace courtyard, she declared, "A ruler's strength lies not in conforming to expectations, but in having the courage to be authentically oneself. From this day forward, Meridia will be known not just for its military might or diplomatic ties, but for its acceptance of all forms of strength." The declaration was accompanied by the establishment of the Royal Academy of Leadership and Strategy, open to all who showed promise, regardless of gender or background. The first class included girls who could lift practice swords with ease, boys who preferred strategy to combat, and everyone in between, all inspired by a princess who had refused to make herself smaller. In her private moments, Athena still visited the training yard at dawn, though now she was often joined by aspiring warriors seeking her guidance. Klaus, watching her teach a young girl the proper stance for wielding a sword, commented, "You've given them something far more valuable than a traditional princess, Your Highness. You've given them permission to be themselves." As for marriage, suitors still came to Meridia's court, but they were different now. They were leaders and warriors in their own right, drawn not by political necessity, but by genuine admiration for the princess who had redefined royal strength. Athena took her time, knowing that if she chose to marry, it would be to someone who could stand beside her as an equal, not above or below. "The kingdom used to fear that my differences would weaken us," Athena reflected one evening, watching the sunset from her favorite spot in the palace gardens. "Instead, they became our greatest strength. Sometimes the best way to serve tradition is to have the courage to change it." And so Meridia flourished under the leadership of its warrior princess, proving that true strength comes not from fitting into predetermined roles, but from having the courage to create new ones. The big muscular princess who no man wanted to marry had become exactly the leader her kingdom needed, not despite her differences, but because of them. Thank you all for joining me on this incredible journey with Princess Athena. As our story comes to a close, remember that true strength isn't about fitting into someone else's mold, it's about having the courage to break it. Athena's journey from the princess no one wanted to marry to the leader everyone wanted to follow shows us that our so-called flaws might just be our greatest gifts in disguise. You know, sometimes the things that make us different, the parts of ourselves that don't quite fit society's expectations, are exactly what the world needs. Whether you're a princess who can bench press a horse, or just someone who feels a little out of step with what others expect from you, your uniqueness is your power. If you enjoyed this story of breaking conventions and finding strength in being yourself, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that being different isn't a weakness, it's a superpower waiting to be embraced. Drop a comment below telling me about a time when your unique qualities turned out to be your greatest strength. And remember, the world doesn't need another copy of someone else, it needs the authentic, powerful you.